Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
It was the night before Good Friday. In a small house at 13 Primrose Terrace, a little man stood in front of a mirror. He wore a gray hat and a red tie. This man was Benjamin Quelch, a clerk who worked for Coal Cellars, Cobble and Clink. Tonight, he had made a big decision. Benjamin had two dreams, to wear a soft hat and to visit Paris. But for years, his wife, Mrs. Quelch, stopped him. Benjamin was a quiet man, and Mrs. Quelch was strong and strict. She decided everything: his money, his food, and even his clothes. She made him wear a tall hat, black ties, and did not let him smoke. She also hated anything foreign and refused to let him go to France. Benjamin didn't mind not smoking, but he hated the tall hat and black tie. He thought he looked like an artist and wanted to dress like one: soft hats and colorful ties. He also wanted to see Paris. A friend at work, Peter Flip, once went there and told exciting stories. This made Benjamin want to go even more. Secretly, he saved small coins to make his dream come true. Finally, the chance came. Mrs. Quelch and their children went to Lowestoft for Easter. Benjamin stayed home with a cleaning lady, Mrs. Widger. Mrs. Quelch told him to spend Good Friday at the British Museum and Easter Monday at the zoo. But then, his boss gave him extra days off, from Friday to Tuesday. Now, Benjamin had the perfect chance to visit Paris. Benjamin planned to tell his wife about the extra holiday. He even started writing a letter to her. But then, a wild idea came to him. Why not spend the holiday in Paris? He counted his secret savings, £5 and 17 shillings. It was enough. His wife would think he was in London, and his boss would think he was at the seaside. Excited, Benjamin decided to go to Paris. That evening, Benjamin packed a small black bag, borrowed from his wife. He bought a soft gray hat and a red tie. He spent money on a train ticket and food coupons for 5 days in Paris. He only had £1 left, but he thought it would be enough. Benjamin wrote fake letters to his wife. He told Mrs. Widger, the cleaning lady, to post them on the right days. The letters talked about visits to the British Museum and the zoo, but these were lies. At the station, Benjamin felt nervous. He walked quickly, boarded the train, and soon found himself crossing the sea to France. The boat ride made him very sick. He felt so bad that he didn't care if he died. When the boat arrived, a steward had to help him stand up and leave. At the dock, French officials spoke loudly in a language Benjamin didn't understand. One officer wanted to check his bag. Benjamin, scared and confused, thought the man was a thief. He held on tightly to the bag. This made the officer suspicious, so he opened it. Inside the bag, there were surprising things: a lady's nightdress and bundles of cigars. Benjamin was shocked. He had accidentally taken the wrong bag. The real owners of the bag, a man and a woman, were nearby. They had picked up Benjamin's bag by mistake. The man told his wife to stay quiet and let Benjamin take the blame. Smiling, they passed through customs without any problems and boarded their train to Paris. Poor Benjamin was taken to an officer with a big mustache and a shiny uniform. The officer accused him of smuggling cigars and resisting an officer. The words were in French, so Benjamin did not understand. He thought he was being accused of stealing the bag and imagined himself going to prison or worse. The officer finally said in broken English, "You smuggle cigars. You must pay a fine, 100 francs. That is 4 pounds in English money. Pay! Pay!" He shouted and waved his hands at Benjamin. Benjamin understood the words 4 pounds and felt relieved it was just money. But he only had a few shillings. He held out his coins and said, "Not got that all." The officer looked unhappy. Benjamin checked his pockets again and found just a tiny coin. It was not enough. The officer asked for Benjamin's name. Afraid of being caught, Benjamin lied. He said his name was Henry Fladgate, his neighbor's name. The officer wrote it down and asked where he lived. Benjamin gave his neighbor's address. Then the officer said, "Très bien. I send telegram. Take him to the cell." Benjamin was taken to the police station, feeling scared and ashamed. Meanwhile, at home, things were not going as Benjamin planned. Mrs. Widger, who was deaf and not very clever, misunderstood his instructions about the letters. Instead of posting them on different days, she posted them both on Good Friday morning. The next day, at breakfast in Lowestoft, Mrs. Quelch was surprised to get 2 letters from Benjamin. She opened them and found one describing a visit to the zoo on Monday, a day that hadn't happened yet. She became suspicious and thought Benjamin was doing something sneaky. Furious, she packed a sandwich, put on her bonnet, grabbed her umbrella, and took the next train to London, ready to find out the truth. When Mrs. Quelch got home, she found Mrs. Widger crying. Mrs. Widger admitted that Benjamin hadn't been home since Thursday night. His tall hat, still hanging in the hall, showed he had not left for work. After getting no more answers, just tears, from Mrs. Widger, Mrs. Quelch went next door to talk to Mrs. Fladgate. She found Mrs. Fladgate crying with a telegram in her hand. The telegram said, "Monsieur Fladgate here detained for smuggling cigars. Fine to pay, 100 francs. Send money for release." Mrs. Quelch sighed. Men. First Benjamin, now Fladgate. I bet they went off together. Mrs. Fladgate gasped. "Mr. Quelch is missing too?" "Yes. He hasn't been home since Thursday. And his hat is still here. What does he even have on his head now? Something silly, I'm sure." Mrs. Fladgate, still crying, said, "But I thought my husband was on a work trip to Scotland." "So did I about Benjamin," snapped Mrs. Quelch. "Don't worry. Just send the money, and they'll let your husband go. But I'd let him wait a little. It'll teach him a lesson." Just as she finished speaking, they heard a cab stop outside. A moment later, Mr. Fladgate walked in, cheerful and wearing a white hat. He dropped his things on the sofa and said, "I'm home, Martha." "Morning, Mrs. Quelch." Mrs. Fladgate hugged him, crying, "You're safe." Mrs. Quelch frowned and said, "Martha, have some self-respect. And you, Mr. Fladgate, how did you escape from your foreign prison?" "Foreign prison? What are you talking about?" said Mr. Fladgate, laughing. "I just came back from a train ride. Not any foreign place." Mrs. Quelch pointed to the telegram and said, "Don't lie. This message shows you were in some foreign country with my husband, Benjamin." Mr. Fladgate read the telegram and shook his head. Someone is playing a joke. I've been on my usual work trip up north. Look, here's the hotel bill from Carlisle. Mrs. Quelch hesitated but said, "Then where is Benjamin? And why this telegram?" Mr. Fladgate thought for a moment. It must be Benjamin. He got into trouble and gave my name instead of his own. But Benjamin doesn't smoke, and why would he be in Dieppe? Maybe he went on a holiday. He's usually so quiet, but sometimes quiet men surprise you. Maybe he panicked and gave my name. Benjamin would never dare do such a thing. Maybe not when you're watching him, said Fladgate. But when he's alone, who knows? He doesn't have much experience, so he probably didn't know how to stay out of trouble. Mrs. Quelch frowned. I won't send money to those French thieves. If Benjamin is in prison, I'll go and get him myself. Mrs. Fladgate gasped. But the sea is rough, and you don't speak French. I'll manage, said Mrs. Quelch firmly. That night, Mrs. Quelch took a boat to Dieppe. The sea was rough, and she was very seasick, but she held tight to her umbrella. What happened when she arrived, how she freed Benjamin, and what they said to each other, she never told anyone. The next day, a cab stopped at their house. Out stepped Mrs. Quelch, looking proud, followed by Benjamin, looking small and sad. His soft hat was crushed, and he carried a black bag. Inside the house, Mrs. Quelch pointed to the fire and said, "Those things, burn them." Benjamin opened the bag, took out a frilly nightdress and cigars, and threw them into the fire. Then his red necktie and soft hat followed. The smell was strange, but Mrs. Quelch didn't care. She poked the fire until everything was gone. Then she turned to Benjamin and said, "I forgive you. But if you ever—" She didn't finish, but Benjamin didn't need her to. His one adventure was more than enough. From then on, his hat stayed tall, and he never wanted to travel again.